Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of Loomer Unleashed. I'm your host, Laura Loomer. And on today's episode of Loomer Unleashed, we're going to be talking about a draconian anti-free speech bill that just passed in the Florida legislature, and it's making its way to Governor Ron DeSantis' desk. It's called HB 269, otherwise known as the Public Nuisances Bill. And essentially what this piece of legislation is it's a bill to criminalize free speech. It's a bill that was created and introduced by Representative Mike Caruso and co-sponsored by Representative Randy Fine. The creators of this legislation created this bill as a way to address a slew of anti-Semitic incidents and leaflets that were passed out by a group called Goyim Defense League. Now, it's important to understand that even though anti-Semitic speech or anti-Semitic literature might be offensive or quote unquote hateful to some individuals, there are no hate speech laws in this country. The Supreme Court has already decided that there's no hate speech exception to the First Amendment, and the First Amendment includes speech that is offensive or otherwise classified as hateful. Unless you are actually inciting violence or physically assaulting somebody, your speech is protected. And so I inherently oppose this bill 100% because it's completely unconstitutional. It's a sad day in America when the Republican-controlled legislature in the state of Florida is trying to crack down and curtail the flow of free speech in America by creating bills disguised to combat anti-Semitism. This bill isn't just going to be used to crack down on perceived acts of anti-Semitism or hateful anti-Jewish rhetoric. No, these legislators are using anti-Semitism as a way to create and pass this legislation. But as we've seen in the past, bills like this are only going to be used to crack down on the free speech rights of other law-abiding citizens. The right to peacefully assemble and protest is constitutionally protected in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And the only thing that this bill does is it cracks down on otherwise constitutionally protected speech. I'm going to read to you sections of this legislation and what happens if you're caught participating in these acts. HB 269 makes it a felony and a hate crime if a person willfully follows, harasses, or interferes with someone based on the person's wearing of religious-based garments or garments commonly associated with a particular religious or ethnic group or any other indication of any religious or ethnic heritage, willfully and maliciously defaces, injures, or damages a religious cemetery or any gravesite, marker, memorial, plaque, statue, museum, school, community center, or other public or private property that has any indication of any religious or ethnic heritage, projects an image outdoors onto a publicly or privately owned building or other property without the owner's written consent if the image evidences religious or ethnic animus, willfully interrupts or disturbs any school or assembly of people met for the worship of God, any assembly of people for the purpose of acknowledging the death of an individual, or for any other lawful purpose with religious or ethnic animus. What is the purpose of creating this legislation when it's already a crime to deface public and private property? We don't need draconian anti-free speech legislation under the guise of combating anti-Semitism to make it a crime to deface a cemetery or to deface somebody's private property. Also, everybody should be outraged that you could potentially face up to 5 years in prison and be charged with a felony for passing out literature or pamphlets. Yes, that's what this legislation serves to do. If somebody decides that your pamphlets or your literature that you're passing out as a form of protest is a hate crime, well, guess what? You're going to go to jail for 5 years and be charged with a felony. So let's take a moment to see how this legislation is going to be applied to conservative activists or even parents in the parental rights movement. Let's say that in Broward County, Florida, which is predominantly and always has been controlled by Democrats, there's an incident of Drag Queen Story Hour, where drag queens and transvestites are trying to sexualize minor children. Well, if you're a parent or a concerned member of the public that decides to show up with pamphlets protesting the sexualization of children and talking about how there's only two genders, you could be charged with a hate crime, because there could be a representative in Broward who identifies as transgender or supports Drag Queen Story Hour that says that your anti-groomer pamphlets are a hate crime and a form of hate speech. So are we going to send parents to jail now for 5 years and charge them with a felony and a hate crime for protesting Drag Queen Story Hour if transgenders say that it's a hate crime? That's the slippery slope of this legislation. And it's interesting because I actually had a conversation with Representative Mike Caruso, who is the representative in the Florida legislature who introduced this legislation. And he had told me that he removed this part of the bill, but it doesn't look like that's the case. And unfortunately, this bill has already passed in the Florida legislature and it's making its way through the Florida Senate. And I've actually been told by my sources that Governor Ron DeSantis plans on signing this anti-free speech legislation while he's in Israel as part of his shadow presidential campaign. So stay tuned. The governor is expected to be in Israel on April 27th. We've seen this in the past where the governor has conducted bill signings in Israel on his foreign visits, and I'm sure that we can expect to see the same this week. I think it's completely inappropriate for the governor of Florida to be signing pieces of legislation abroad. That's something that needs to be done here in the state of Florida. I think it's also ridiculous that with 9 days left in the Florida legislative session, the governor is parading around on an international tour as part of his campaign for president when he should be here in the state of Florida trying to kill draconian legislation like HB 269 that threatens the free speech rights and the right to protest of all Florida citizens. This is yet another example of how Republicans in a Republican-controlled legislature here in Florida are failing the citizens of Florida. You would expect there to be more free speech in the age of censorship and big tech social media censorship with a Republican-controlled legislature, but who needs Democrats and big tech tyrants in Silicon Valley when you have Republicans in the Florida legislature criminalizing free speech for them? If you enjoyed this content today, please be sure you subscribe to my Substack at lauraloomer.substack.com. It's free to subscribe, but you can support my independent journalism and political commentary by upgrading your subscription for $7 per month. Also, please be sure you're following me on Twitter, Gab, Truth Social, and Getter at Laura Loomer so that you never miss any of my exclusive updates and reports. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video. You can protect your wealth with gold and silver, just like so many other Americans and even banks are doing right now. Call 855-317-5157 or visit goldco.com/Laura Loomer to learn how to protect your savings with gold and silver. Take action today to protect yourself and your family from financial collapse. Again, call 855-317-5157 or visit goldco.com/Laura Loomer and learn how you could get up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. That's 855-317-5157 or goldco.com/Laura Loomer.